Hi, this is Miss Terry, and we're going to start summer session mental health today. This will be over Unit 1, which is chapters 1 through 6, and I will try to do it in one video, but it goes too long, then we'll have two videos. So if you will follow along with me in the textbook, chapter 1, the history of mental health. Mental health is the ability to cope and adjust to recurrent stressors of life in an acceptable way. So as we have issues that come up in life, if we can adjust to those stressors or anxieties, then we have a healthy sense of our mental health and mental well-being. And our mental health is influenced by three factors. Our inherited characteristics, our childhood nurturing, and life circumstances. And I've always said my father was a warrior, and my mother lived day to day, and she still does. And I inherited the worrying habits from my dad. My brother was just like my mother and never worried about anything. So I think I do believe you inherit a lot of those characteristics. The way we're raised, I do believe influences us. As I've always heard my mother say, just live day by day, one day at a time, and your faith will help you get through any bad times. I know y'all relied upon something to help you get through this past year. And so that certainly does help us keep our mental health stable. And then life circumstances. We can't get through life without having some sort of an issue. I can't imagine that we won't. But those three factors certainly do help us get through and keep our mental health stable. If we have things that come up, daily activities, things to impair our judgment or alter our reality, then we become not completely mental health confident and may have some issues that we have to deal with. The chapter describes the early years of mental health and kind of barbaric years, and the health illness continuum. Throughout your nursing career, you're going to hear about the health illness continuum that goes from high level wellness to severe illness and somewhere in between, and we try to keep that continuum in balance. So I want you to read about Greece and Rome and their theories, the Dark Ages, demonics, the witches, the hunter superstition, the Renaissance, and all of that is covered in your PowerPoints that are also accompanying this video. But in the 19th century, it was not until 1841 that Dorothea Dix started influencing the way that we look at mental health. And she looked at prisoners and studied that, and she presented her findings to anyone that would listen. And her study and her untiring struggle to help those that she saw as mentally ill and needing help changed the whole world. And you will see in your information that I have posted that I did post some information about her and other researchers that I want you to know. You will hear about Dorothea Dix as you continue your nursing education through your RN program. So by the late 1800s, a two-class system of psychiatric care emerged: private care for the wealthy and publicly provided for the remainder of the society. And this is what Dorothea Dix helped. She helped prepare the way for those that were not financially able to help themselves. In the 1900s, ushered in reform movements. Clifford Beers wrote a book called A Mind That Found Itself. itself. And he was in prison and tried to commit suicide, and he wrote this book again to try to help those that he found that were mentally ill. And he helped prevent removing the stigma of mental illness. Then World War I, of course, came, and we were still fighting the battle of mental health and the soldiers that went off to war. And there was one strange treatment that we read about is insulin therapy. And they would give so much insulin that they would induce comas. And supposedly that was supposed to help them come out of their mental depression. I can't imagine that they didn't kill them with that, and but that was one therapy that started around 1930. I find very interesting. And at the same time, a new class of drugs that lifted the spirits of people were amphetamines, and we know the issue with amphetamines. So, excuse me. I'm sorry. The Korean War, Vietnam War in the 70s, and the conflicts, all of that produced such great stress for me during the Vietnam War, and some of you maybe, but PTSD became known, and I experienced that as a nurse. Patients who had come back from Vietnam that were having post-traumatic stress, and had experiences with those who did as they were patients in the hospital. So a lot of issues with mental health, mental disease, and then the psychotherapeutic drugs came into being, and you've studied about those in pharmacology. Lithium is one. There's many side effects, but is used. There are a lot of psychotherapeutic drugs. Thorazine is another one. And then the movement came where deinstitutionalization started. And I definitely experienced that. In 1994, the number of hospitals that were taking the mentally ill started closing up shop and wouldn't take anybody. So when I first started nursing, if we had a mentally ill patient, we had a room for them that had they couldn't get out of the room. They couldn't harm themselves to the best of our ability, that sort of thing. And then we called Terrell State Hospital to come get them. Or they were in a room. We had them in ICU, and I was in ICU. Of course, there were no doors in ICU, but we tried to manage them to the best of our ability. Then we would get approval to get them sent to Terrell, call the police. The police would come and officially do the documentation to get them admitted to Terrell. Well, then things really started changing in the early 90s, and because of the cost, etc., Terrell pretty much just stopped taking anybody. So we, as nurses, then had to manage these patients in the hospital, and it was really difficult when you were trying to deal with someone who was having all kinds of issues, and then you had another group of patients. And I'm sure that is continuing to this day. So then we learned how to have family members come, we would hire sitters, we would do all kinds of things to help us try to manage these patients that had no money to get admitted to a private hospital. Of course, there were private hospitals, but many people didn't have the money to do that. So I personally saw that. Terrell State Hospitals is still in existence, and they do have patients, but I think it's really different than it was the day. And I did a rotation at Terrell, one that I will never forget, but I did a rotation at Terrell, and I'm sure it's quite different out there today than it was when I went. Then Congress got involved and started working on community health centers, and that was to try to support these people in community settings. So Congress started funding places for the mentally ill to go to. Medicare, Medicaid bill of 65, combine that and to help people in the community. Community mental health centers expanded in the 70s, and but the demands overran the system, and so we had some back in the 70s, but there just weren't enough. The OBRA Act came about in 81, which repealed the mental health system, and this resulted in block grant funding. And so communities would apply for this grant money to try to help place patients somewhere. The 80s, this funding, like I was talking about, was curtailed, and it wasn't until the 21st century that we began to focus again more on mental illness and try to handle it in community settings better than what we were doing. We've accepted the fact that it is many times a biochemical imbalance, and so medications are used, I think, a lot more. In your wrap-up on Chapter 1, just need to know, I need to know all of this, but mental health is the ability to cope. So if you're coping and you have family systems, support systems, methods that you're using, then you can balance your mental health in times of stress. If you cannot do that and you have an inability to cope, then you may have mild, which may progress to severe mental illness. We talked about the what is believed to be the causes, and throughout the years how the treatments have changed. We talked about Clifford Beers and his experience as a mental health patient, and Sigmund Freud. Haven't talked about him yet, but Sigmund Freud certainly delved into mental health, and I do have something posted on him. I think we'll pick him up later. I do have something posted on Freud, and he looked at the emotional side of mental health and to try to help patients. Current mental health care systems, that is on Chapter 2. They talk about Canada, Norway, Britain, Australia. Most of those, if not all, have universal health care, and the United States, of course, does not. And so there again, we're talking about how we're going to deal with them on inpatient and outpatient. Clients who receive inpatient care remain in a safe environment for 24 hours. All aspects of their care focus on providing therapeutic assistance. Discharge occurs when the client has improved and has a treatment plan. So if we call from the hospital to try to get them into either a private facility or where we can get them, then they're protected for 24 hours so that they can rest and not feel alone. They have care there, and a treatment plan is designed for them. They're just safe and secure, and they can focus and work on their what they perceive to be their problem. A lot of the issues with mental health is recidivism. Sorry, that's a hard word for me to say. And you heard about that in prisons, etc. Is that revolving door. And patients get outside, they're on medication, maybe they can't afford the medication, which is not uncommon at all. Then they go back down that spiral, and then they're back in the hospital, and then they just do it over and over again. But you will hear many times them say, I ran out of medicine, I can't afford my medicine, I've been cutting it in half, I've not been taking the dose that the doctor ordered, etc. So then the community support system, we talked about briefly. There is a chart in unit chapter 2 about how to protect them, patient advocacy places, rehab, family and community support, peer support, income support, housing support, and health support. So they need all of that because many times they are not working, and I just can't imagine. But they have to have the community supporting them in order to manage their illness. And so some of the community settings that you all can think about that is in your community, literacy studies. Some of the churches are offering literacy programs, certainly Meals on Wheels always. There are crisis centers. WIC is a wonderful program. I know Navarro County has a very good WIC program for women and infants and children, providing formula and health care. Many communities have welcome wagons to where they come and welcome you to the community, to the apartment or whatever that they're living in, so that they feel like they belong somewhere. There are shelters for victims of domestic violence. There is a shelter in Corsicana that is, I served on the board at one time, but it is for women especially, but families can be accepted. It was a wonderful program where they bring them in, and was a big 2-story house, and they bring them in and set them on a budget. They have to find a job. They have rules, of course, but they have to find a job, contribute to their budget. They have to attend classes. As nurses, we would go out there and do nutrition classes for them and try to get them on their feet, take care of the children. We had a wonderful Christmas program for them every year with tons of gifts, and but there were rules. They had to take their medicine. They had to come in, not be out at night, that sort of thing. And so there are wonderful community places. I want you to think about where you live. And there's a Hope Center in Corsicana, and there's a Children's Advocacy Center in Corsicana, Salvation Army, and there was another one across the street from Salvation Army. But think about the ones that are in your community, so that as you start nursing, you can help your patients seek the community services that are available that we need to be aware of. And of course, community mental health can be delivered everywhere, in the emergency department, in residential homes, daycare treatment centers. Where I am now, they have a lot of daycare centers for those with Alzheimer's or brain injuries, or just the elderly, where the caregiver can get some respite care, and you can take your loved one to a daycare center for the elderly. And I think they're pretty expensive, but some people can afford that. But that still is an option if you're the caregiver and you need some respite care. So I find all that very interesting, and it's just a challenge for us as nurses to stay abreast of what is in our community. Also in this chapter, we talk about the mental health team members, and as I've talked to you before, healthcare is a team. and we have to always remember that. So we have certainly on the continuum of healthcare, you have psychiatrists and clinical psychologists and psychiatric social workers, psychiatric nurses, assistants, occupational therapists, expressive therapists, which I find is very interesting. And they're trained in art therapy, sometimes music therapy, pet therapy. I think that's a wonderful career. Certainly dietitians, chaplains, all of those become members of the health team. Please look at your end of the chapter, on Chapter 2, the key points. I've actually highlighted every one of them, but we want to think of healthcare, mental health challenges holistically, and that's where it comes from, that team. You want to look at it on a holistic, on that continuum of care, and it takes all of us to help these patients. Ethical and legal issues. We talk about values and morals. Attitudes or ideas that help shape our points of view. The term can also describe one's outlook, such as he has a cheerful attitude, or he wakes up on the wrong side of the bed every day, or he has a positive attitude. His glass is always half full, that sort of thing. A belief is a conviction that's intellectually accepted as true, whether or not it is based on fact. So you believe in certain things. You believe this country is going to prosper, and you have a belief system that centers around that. Value is something that's held dear, a feeling about the worth of an item, idea, or behavior. Values are formed in childhood. Morals are based on one's attitudes, beliefs, and values. One's morals define right or wrong behavior. Once established, morals become deeply ingrained and are not easily changed. So we hope, as we have raised our children and taught them right from wrong, that we have instilled in them proper and high values and morals. Their moral being is what will help them get through life. Values clarifications. Your values are different from other people's values, so you have to remember that your values as a nurse probably or perhaps will be different from your patient's values, and you've got to work yourself through that. There's a step-by-step process, and that is listed in Chapter 3. The process helps us be more aware of our own values and our interactions. Values clarification involves 3 steps: choosing, prizing, and acting. And when you have a patient that you're having a hard time coping with, you have to work yourself through these 3 steps. First, you've chosen to be a nurse. You've chosen to care for people, and you have to remember that, because sometimes it is hard. I'm here to tell you, it is hard to talk yourself into taking care of somebody that is completely against the things that you believe in. But you have chosen to take care of them, and so you have to set your beliefs, not your morals, not don't do anything wrong, I'm not saying that, but you have to set those aside and understand that you've chosen to be a nurse. You prize the value of caring for your clients, that you want them to see you as compassionate and concerned. And you act on your values by accepting the unkept, scruffy man as a person of worth. And certainly, I believe many times that's the person that nurses maybe reach out to more. when you see a little frail little person that's come in that just has nothing, I think your heart goes out to them. I think sometimes it's harder to care for the one, I don't mean to be biased, but the highly wealthy, those that come in, it's my way or the highway kind of stuff. Sometimes it's harder to care for those patients because their values sometimes are different than ours than it is to care for those who are really needy and needs help. And that's where your compassion comes out as a nurse, I think. But you've got to work yourself through all of that and know that when you meet up against somebody, remember, you chose to be a nurse. You chose to be compassionate and caring, and you want to help them. There are many rewards in nursing, I've always said, and I probably told you before, my mama would always tell me I got a star in my crown when I had taken care of somebody that really touched me, and so I think you're going to feel that too someday. Now they talk a little bit about client rights and care provider rights. We won't go into that a lot, but there's a patient rights, and they're usually posted on the walls of the hospitals. They have a right to compassionate care, to proper care. They have a right to know what's going on with them, etc. Care providers have rights also. We have a right to know that we are going to have protective equipment, that we're going to have proper equipment that is working, and we won't be made to work 24 hours in a row and all that kind of stuff. So there are patient care rights and care provider rights. Ethics is a set of rules or values that govern right behavior. So ethics reflect values, morals, and principles of right and wrong. The purpose of ethical behavior is to protect the rights of people. So you always want to act ethically. Ethical principles are the concepts that form the basis for professional code of ethics, and there is a professional code of ethics within nurses, and we follow our code of ethics. The concepts of autonomy, beneficent, non-maleficent, and justice are the main ethical principles on which codes of ethics are established. I want you to be sure you read those. You're going to have test questions on those. Autonomy refers to the right of the people to act for themselves and make decisions. So they have the right to say yes or no, and they can refuse treatment if they want to. Beneficent means to actively do good. Non-maleficent can be stated in 3 words: do no harm. And we have to always remember that we are to do no harm. That means that if you have a med error, that you report your med error. And I had one time, and boy, it was all I could do to get myself over it. It was minor, but it was major to me, and you have to report your med errors to protect your patient and prevent that from happening again. And there are ethical committees in hospitals and probably in long-term care, and they look at their med errors and they track what the variables were and why they happened. Mine happened because I had 2 little women next door to one another in ICU, and they looked alike. It's best to remember their names were similar. I can't remember that, but one needed Lanoxin and the other was in sinus rhythm. And I didn't follow the five rights, and I walked in there and gave the wrong lady the Lanoxin, and I about died. And so the doctor said I didn't hurt her, but I just about died. So you have to follow the 5 rights, but you have to report if you do something wrong. Justice means that clients are treated equally, fairly, and respectfully, and no talking out in the hallway, no talking about other patients. Keep your information covered, keep your computer screen off or on asleep where you don't leave it out in the hallway for other people to see it, etc. etc. Confidentiality, you know that. Fidelity is the obligation to keep your word. If you tell a patient you're going to come back in 30 minutes, you go back in 30 minutes. Even if you can't do what you were going to do, you tell them, I'm sorry, I wanted to check back in with you. I've got a little crisis going on down the hall, and I promise I will be back at 1 o'clock to do your bath or whatever. Veracity is the duty to tell the truth, and we kind of already talked about that, but you will be asked by clients and people in the community, by your patients, is that a good doctor? And so, you have to not say. So I always say, well, they've been here in the community 10 years or so. I've worked with them, and just sort of leave it at that. But your patients will, well, is he good? He's fixing to do surgery. Well, you need to talk to your doctor and have him tell you how many of these surgeries he's done, or have him tell you about this surgery. So you must tell the truth, and but you have to be very careful when people ask you questions like that. Code of ethics. We've talked about ethical conflict. You will have that every day. Ethical dilemmas exist when there's an uncertainty or a disagreement about moral principles that endorse different courses of action. So an ethical dilemma will occur if a patient said they didn't want to be on a ventilator, and a daughter comes in from out of town and they say, oh yeah, you are going to put my mother on a ventilator. And so then the doctor gets involved, and you start getting paperwork together, and sometimes you have to get an outside person to be the spokesperson for the patient, but there'll be an ethical committee, and so that's usually what I saw was when it had to do with life and death, prolonging life. I never really saw, I don't think, trying medications that weren't designed to be for that particular illness. We did do research, but I've never been asked to give a medication that it wasn't manufactured and intended for. But there are a lot of ethical issues, and most that I would say involved patients, families, when information wasn't clear from the beginning what a patient wanted at end of life. So there's guidelines for making ethical decisions. Be sure you read that. But that is what the committee does. They get the information together, they share ideas, and they talk through the problems, and develop a plan to handle that ethical issue. Then there's all kinds of legal issues. Standards of practice is a measurement for comparison by which one evaluates an action. So standards of practice, standards of care, nursing we have our own standards of care, standards of practice that we have to practice within those guidelines and boundaries. This is a litigious society, and so you have to I hate to say you have to keep it in mind, but it needs to be in the back of your mind. But that's why documenting correctly, giving your meds correctly, just dotting all your I's, crossing all your T's, I had a patient, one time I was wheeling them in on the stretcher in room B. I still remember what room it was, and the family member was behind me and said, "My lawyer's on the way in with me." I'm like, "Bring them in." So, I mean, we hadn't even got them in the room yet, and they were bringing a lawyer in. I said, just, have at it and go out in the waiting room. So, you never know. You just need to, if the one I remember vividly is a nurse was sued one time for not having oxygen on a patient, and oxygen was ordered, and I've just never forgotten it. And the hospital was sued, but within that suit, one of the things they brought up was that oxygen was not on the patient on whatever shift it was or whatever. Well, patients pull those off and they fall off, but I never forgot that, and I was new to nursing, and I always made sure that oxygen, if it was ordered, it was on my patient. And you just have to keep doing rounds and keep checking, and don't sit down out there at the nurse's station and think everything's going to be all right. You've got to check on your patient, and you're the one that can get sued, and I never wanted to be sued. So, you just have to do your very, very best. And some of the things we talk about that are areas of potential liability have to do with fraud, of course, defamation of character, libel and slander. Back when I was talking about the doctor, you can't go out there and say, "Oh, really, he's new. He I don't know if I'd use him or not." Oh, man, don't say that. And so you can't talk about people. You better watch these social network things and Facebook and Twitter and all of that. You are going to be a nurse, and you're going to be held to a different standard. And I'm telling you, you better be careful. And people will slip up in the neighborhood. I remember at church in Sunday school, people would say, "Well, how is so-and-so that was a class member? How's she doing?" Well, you can't answer that question. I would say, "She's in the hospital," or, "As far as I know, okay." And you cannot answer that question. And people will ask you over and over again, and you just have to be real careful. And you sure can't not be talking about people, slandering them, putting in writing, assault and battery. That's real important when it comes to restraints and getting upset and losing your temper and saying something. You just can't do that. You cannot do that. You always have to remember you're a nurse, and you're compassionate and caring, as hard as it is. And you can't go out to the nursing station and start griping. That's the worst. And so I want you to rise above all of that. You're going to work with nurses that do that. And I want you to rise above that and be that. I want you to be a perfect nurse, but I want you to be way up there on that continuum, and you be the professional nurse, the one that we've taught you to be. And don't get out there. Don't let people tell jokes, nasty jokes. They knew when I was in ICU, doctors knew to come in and behave. I mean, I just didn't put up with it because patients could hear that. My daddy one time was dying in the ER in another city, and I needed help. He was having a lot of confusion, and he was so sick. And I still remember the nurses were out there talking about Tupperware, and they were eating French fries. And I almost died. And I went out there and told them that I didn't appreciate it one bit. My daddy needed help. And, so don't be that kind of nurse. Don't put yourself at a point where you could be sued. And suing was the least part of my thought. I just wanted to come take care of my daddy. But don't put yourself in those positions where you can get yourself in trouble. An invasion of privacy, we've talked about that. Patients have a right to say no. They have a right for privacy. You close that curtain, you shut that door, you ask them and and you tell them what you're going to do. If you're going to bathe them, you keep them half covered, and you bathe only the part of the body that needs to be bathed. You just need to treat people with respect and honor, just like you would want to be treated with respect and honor. False imprisonment, we've talked about that. That is restraints. You have to follow your institution's policy, but that is not your first thought. If you have to do it for the safety and protection of the patient, you can only do that if your organization allows it. You have to have a doctor's order. It has to be signed, and but you be very, very careful about restraints. And then in the textbook it talks about restraints, how often they have to be removed. You have to check the circulation, but you follow your organization's policy. Negligence is defined as the omission or commission of an act that a reasonable and prudent nurse would or would not do. Negligence, if there's a spill, let's say on the floor in the hospital, and you don't immediately stop and get it cleaned up, and a patient's walking in the hallway and falls, or a public citizen, then that's negligence. You saw it in a restaurant or whatever. You're always a nurse, and it's your responsibility to protect the public and not be negligent. Malpractice, of course, we know what that is, but the care provider owned a duty to the client and he didn't do it, and an injury occurred and an actual loss or damage occurred, and so that is malpractice, and you sure don't want to go down that road. Informed consent, what I want you to know is the person responsible for informed consent is the physician. We help do that. You follow your policy in your organization, but when I was nursing, we would get the operative permit and you would get it signed, but the physician had to come in, and now he has to come in and mark the site of the surgery. He answers the questions. Your patients will start asking you questions about that surgery, and the physician needs to do that. He needs to answer the questions. You can, if they have a lot of questions and they're feeling unsure about it, then you have to contact the physician, and they are responsible for answering the questions of the patients before that surgery starts. You can help, but they are the final person who has responsibility. Elopement, that's a bad thing, but that's when patients leave the hospital. I'm not going to say I've lost a few, but I've had to track down some, and when I was nursing, smoking was very popular, and but a lot of times the patients would go outside to smoke, and there you were, you'd go into their room to give them meds, and they're not there. So I never lost one permanently, but you'd have to go downstairs and see if they were downstairs, and some of them were bound and determined they were going to go outside. A duty to warn, if a patient, especially a mental health, well, any patient, but a mental health patient, said that they were going to hurt someone, their wife, their spouse, their children, you have a duty to notify that person. I certainly wouldn't do it all by myself. I would get my supervisor, I would get the ethics committee, whatever, but you have a duty to report that, and certainly if that patient was being discharged, I would not discharge them until that was taken care of. All right, I think we're going to stop here, and we'll do 4, 5, and 6 in another chapter.